Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Warren Hatch. Warren, welcome. How are you today?
Great, and thanks for having me here. I've been looking forward to this since we talked about it a few months ago. It's going to be a great conversation.
Absolutely. I'm super excited also. Want to wish you a happy Friday. Everybody also joining us from around the world, thank you for being here. We are going to have a really profound and highly applicable conversation on super forecasting, the art and science of prediction. So all of us make lots of decisions in our leadership roles on a day-to-day basis. We also make a lot of decisions at home and in our communities at large. And of course, we want to make the best decisions that we can. And by fully engaging in this, what's going to be a very interactive conversation, I hope that all of us will become better decision makers, better predictors of the future, so we can be the best leaders we can be for all those that depend on us. Warren is truly an ideal guide to help lead this conversation. He is the CEO of a company called Good Judgement, which is truly renowned for using scientifically validated methodology to unlock the secret to better forecasts and better decisions. Before joining Good Judgement, Hatch was a partner at Mac Allenden Research, where he identified thematic investment opportunities in global markets for institutional investor clients. He has a doctorate in politics from Oxford, also a master's in Russian and international policy studies from Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and bachelor's in history from the University of Utah. Warren, really appreciate you being here. And to kick things off for us, would love to hear from you. One, what is your vision and mission at Good Judgement? So if your company achieved all of its goals, what would the world look like? What would decision-making look like? And if in addition to that, you could also define for us, what is super forecasting? How do you define it?
Sure. Well, I think in a nutshell, central to our vision is to have thinking probabilistically about an uncertain future to be as normal, as customary as it is to be thinking about the weather probabilistically. It would be terrific if we saw election coverage and political coverage and everything else, where instead of saying, oh, well, I think there's a slight chance that the tariffs will be lifted next year, that the pundits or the reporters would say there's a 10% chance that this will occur by next June. And so that we can hold them accountable, we can better understand what they're saying, we have a shared language, we can compare things, and we can improve the quality of our decisions by being precise about what we mean about uncertain futures. And that's really what forecasting basically comes down to. It's thinking probabilistically about the future. And so what super forecasting is about is what are the steps you can take to come up with the best possible forecast that you can, using crowdsourced techniques, data-driven, evidence-based steps to improve your own thinking as well as that of your teams.
Excellent. Well, what can be more important, right? So if we're able to just consistently improve how we're able to make those decisions, then clearly every area of our life and all the organizations that we touch will be much better off than they would have been otherwise. So before we dive into it, a couple of things. One, today's conversation is being live translated into Spanish. So for everybody joining us from Spanish-speaking countries, feel free to switch, and there's an interpretation button where you can select the Spanish channel if that's helpful. Hope you find that valuable. Hope to have it in other languages coming soon as well. Warren, before we dive into the key ingredients of super forecasting, I want to take a step back and actually have you share with us what you consider to be the biggest mistakes and misperceptions that people make or have when it comes to forecasting and prediction. Right now, I don't know how you see it, but given how, for example, around the elections in the US, people's trust in forecasts and predictions are not necessarily maybe at an all-time high. Share with us, what are the mistakes we might be making in our perceptions, so that then we can jump onto the key ingredients of how to make better decisions and better predictions.
Sure, there are a couple that show up time and again, and we see them right now in real time. The first one is the use of vague language when we're talking about forecasts and we're seeing that right now. Turn on the news, you'll see the news anchors and the experts or the pundits all use very vague, evasive language. There's a distinct possibility that Pennsylvania will tilt toward Biden. Now, using language like that means that if it happens, you say, ah, well, I was right, see? But if it doesn't happen, well, I only said it was a possibility. So it doesn't, it means that we don't have accountability. It means that we don't have the shared language that we're just talking about by using vague terminology. Mistake number one. Mistake number two is not updating. So here's my view. That's it. I'm done. I'm moving on. One and done. That's not a good way to do forecasting. You definitely want to keep track of what your forecast is so you can be held accountable from day to day or week to week. But as new information comes in, as your views evolve, you should be updating them. Updating is the second big one. And then the third one is keeping score, so that when something occurs, you go back and match your thinking along the way with what actually occurred. And you learn from that. If you don't do that, then you can fall into a hindsight bias trap. And we're going to see hindsight bias erupt in the next week, where you're going to see, and this is an easy forecast, that a lot of experts are going to say, ah, well, of course, everyone knew that was going to happen. How could you miss that? It was so obvious. It had to happen this way. It happened 4 years ago. Going into the election, there was a lot of uncertainty about who was going to win. In fact, if there was any certainty, it was on the other side. It happened, and then the headlines filled up. The inevitability of Trump. We're going to see the same thing. So you want to keep score so you don't fall into that bad pattern. It's a bad habit.
Excellent. Thank you, Warren. So essentially, you boil it down to use of vague language, lack of accountability, not updating views, and this hindsight bias trap. Super helpful. What I want to do, I guess, is like, you gave us this like amazing activity that we can all do together. So for everybody participating live, I'm about to post a link into the chat window, and I just did. So please check out what I just pasted. There is a website, and it takes 1 minute, just 60 seconds, for you to click that link, enter the 5-digit code that's there, and answer a couple of questions. Warren told me it would only take 1 minute. And based on your responses, Warren is going to help demonstrate some of the key methodologies or key reflections that he wants us to have. Warren, as people are doing that, I want to just start asking you my first question when it comes to the fundamentals and the methodologies. So of all the different ingredients that you and your team use to be effective super forecasters to enable your clients and everyone you work with to be better predictors of the future, what would you say are the most critical ingredients of your methodology that we can apply in our own lives as well to be better predictors? So without going into detail on any of them, if you could just share with us the key steps in the process or the key inputs, and then we'll continue from there.
Yeah, so the Good Judgement Project, which was the research phase of all of this is where they did a lot. They were part of a US government-sponsored competition with about 5 other university-based teams to come up with ways to improve on the wisdom of the crowd, which is what we're doing right now. We're doing a wisdom of the crowd exercise, works really well. Can you do better? So, and this was something that the intelligence community sponsored following some pretty significant intelligence failures. So they genuinely wanted to find ways to improve the skill set of their own analysts. And Team Good Judgement, their approach was, unlike the others who had one big idea, was let's try a lot of small things. Let's just be empirical and data-driven. What are the things that we can do that might make small differences? And when you put them all together, make a big difference. And that's what occurred. They did find ways to make small interventions that added up to a big significant improvement that outperformed intelligence analysts by 30% on the identical questions, even with their access to classified information. And all those interventions, they broke down into 4 key categories. The first is you can identify people who have innate characteristics that make them better forecasters. Some people just have a background, a personality approach to things that make them better. They're open-minded, so they're always testing their beliefs about the world instead of digging in their heels. And a lot of people dig in their heels, doesn't matter what you say, what happens, they're sticking to it. They're not good forecasters. Being good at pattern recognition is another characteristic. So you can identify people. They gave it, and I was a test subject, that's how I got involved. They gave us tons of these kinds of psychometric tests, drilled them down into maybe 2 or 3 things that make a big difference. Those are 2: pattern recognition and belief updating. Second thing is training. So even if you don't have those characteristics, you can still improve through some very directed training. And some interventions, maybe half an hour or an hour, can have a lasting impact and boost accuracy by 10% or more. Other things you can do can make even greater contributions. So training, if you're good, you can get better. If you don't know those, you can still get better. The third thing is having the right environment. Turns out being on teams makes a huge difference. So put your forecasters, your analysts on teams, ideally with anonymity so that they can express their views safely and on a level playing field so they don't get anchored on the high status individual in the group. Everyone's views are equal. We hear from everybody on a good, effective team. The good ideas will rise to the top in that kind of structured environment. And then the fourth thing you can do is aggregate. We use some algorithms to squeeze more signal out of your own crowd and tamp down some of the noise. And you put all those 4 things together, you can get a really sizable boost.
Excellent, Warren. So excited to go and dive deep into these. You made a critical distinction here. There's obviously, on the one hand, as an analyst, making better predictions as part of your job. And then there's the role of a decision maker who then sees all the information and has to make a call. So what I'd like to do is to go into each of these and get your practical suggestions for what an analyst can do about this and what a decision maker should keep in mind. So to do that, first one, you said that, first of all, identify people who have innate characteristics. Share with us what exactly those are. How do we deal with that? And then regardless of what our characteristics are, what can we best develop?
Sure. Well, and it's also fascinating to know what doesn't matter. So there are dozens of things they tested for. Some of the things that don't matter, seniority in and of itself does not correlate with forecasting accuracy. Other things might, but just pure seniority does not. Being conscientious makes no difference. You can be a slob, you can be a backstabbing, whatever. It doesn't mean you're good or bad. The things that do matter, high on the list is pattern recognition. So if you are, so you can imagine, the best way I think about it is you're looking at a mosaic, right? And the tiles just start to get filled in. And if you are good at recognizing what the mosaic is early, that you're skilled at pattern recognition, that is a great indicator. Another one is the actively open-minded thinking. So you're challenging your views, not protecting them, as an important characteristic. And you can test for these things too. And being creative in your search for information is another very good one. So you're not satisfied with just a single source of information. You're looking for multiple sources of information and seeing what story they cumulatively will tell you. Those are 3 big ones.
Okay, so share with us from an action-taking perspective, how do you test people for these abilities to see, who you should be, who you should be trusting with the analysis? And then share with us also from a decision maker's perspective, how can they take, these particular characteristics being important and apply it within their teams?
Sure. Well, so we can come to us because we have them. But the first one, the pattern recognition, you can just Google Raven's progressive matrices. And this was something that was developed back in the 30s and 40s. And it was used very actively during World War II by the British government and here too in the US to find pilots. Because what happened was during the Battle of Britain and the war is they lost a lot of pilots, and most of the pilots that they had came from the universities where there was a lot of higher education. So they needed to find a new pool of pilots. And so this test shows you a series of geometric shapes that progress into a particular form. And your task is to identify what the pattern, what the rules are that lead to different patterns taking shape. And so you don't have to be literate, you just have to be very good at identifying patterns. And if you're good at that, on that test, that meant that you were probably going to be a good pilot or a good submariner. And at that time, it probably also meant your life expectancy was going to go down because they were going to put you in a plane or in a submarine. But it's also a great way to identify forecasting talent. And it doesn't take long to take these kinds of tests. And it's a great initial indicator of forecasting talent. The only way, of course, to confirm that talent is to observe it. And you want to see how people do forecasting on a series of questions. 20, 30, 40 is actually a good number before you can start having confidence in what that initial evaluation might have indicated. But if you continue to do that, what you will observe, and as we observed in the research project, we observe now as a company, is that there's going to be a small group that emerges who are better than the rest. And during the research project, they was not part of the original research design. They saw these people consistently better than the rest, the top 2% or so. And these became the super forecasters. That's the label they gave. And the testable proposition was, if we put them together, will they get better or will they revert to the mean? Were they just lucky? And there was a lot of people who thought it was just luck. Turns out they continue to get better. And that same kind of an approach is what a lot of organizations are doing now too, where you can bring in a forecasting platform of some, and to have the entire crowd, the whole organization, as much as possible, opining on the questions that really matter. And what organizations will find is a smaller group will emerge, and they can be tasked with the much tougher, thornier forecast questions that really matter for internal decision making. So that's a great way to build up internal capabilities and identifying forecasting talent wherever it might be.
Excellent. Thank you, Warren. So you mentioned the kind of second intervention that's could be very useful is what you refer to as training in general. So specifically, what can each person do, whether they're the leader of the organization or they're one of many individuals who help make better decisions to be made? Share with us what kind of training works. What can we all be doing starting tomorrow, starting next week, to be better predictors of the future?
Well, and there are two pieces, and what matters for analysts and what matters for decision makers has some overlap, but there's also kind of a good division of labor that also shows up in the kinds of training that can be helpful. To improve forecasting skills, there are best practices that can be taught. They can be learned and they can be practiced whether it's online or in a virtual workshop, or read the book even that Phil Tetlock wrote, is a way to get familiar with what the best practices are. Now, of course, reading a book is not the same as actually doing. So if you read a book about a violin, it's not going to tell you how to play it. If you read a book about the physics of riding a bicycle, it's not going to tell you how to ride the bike. You got to get up and do it, and you got to start forecasting as well. So they go together to be having some training, but also some very active forecasting on a number of forecast questions where you get rapid and fast feedback is the way to go. And some of these best practices we talked about at the outset is you want to update, you want to record your thinking, you want to share views, but a very foundational one, step one in Superforecasting 101 is this idea of a base rate. And for those of you familiar with Daniel Kahneman, this is the outside view versus inside view. And so what does that mean? The example that Phil Tetlock gives in his book, it's a great one, is imagine you're at a wedding and you have the bad fortune of sitting next to a super forecaster who nudges you in the ribs and says, what are the odds that this is going to last? And most people, after being deeply offended by the question, will say, well, look at the happy couple. It's a wonderful day. It's a match made in heaven. It's going to last forever. But the thing is, it's not going to last forever probabilistically. If you have the even worse luck of going to 100 such weddings and having your ribs nudged and you go, it's a match made in heaven, come back in 5 years, not all 100 marriages are going to make it. So that's the inside view. It's far better to take a step back, take the outside view. What's a comparison class? What's a base rate where you can start your thinking, where you can anchor your initial forecast? Because that's an anchoring is a big part of what goes on, because once we start on a spot, it's tough to move. So we want to start in the best possible place. When it comes to marriages, the best place to start is, well, what's the divorce rate? That's the base rate there. And then you work your way into the particulars of the situation rather than the other way around. And we see that certainly, say, with elections. People's view on the election usually is, well, we'll Biden this and Trump that. But a far better place to start, if you're thinking about it, is what's the base rate? And the base rate for incumbents running for re-election, maybe 2/3 of the time. It's not a great number. It's not a lot of data points, but it's better than starting with the inside view. So that's foundational. Outside view, start there, then work in. That's a very important part of the training. Everything builds on that.
Excellent. Any additional rules of thumb that you use with your team, or just super forecasters in general? Because obviously there's always imperfect information, no matter how much on the inside, how much data you have. Any other kind of rules of thumb that you train super forecasters on that we can learn from as well?
One of my own favorites is this idea of, the fancy term is scope sensitivity. But it's basically, when you think about a question, do a thought experiment. What would your forecast be at different points in time, or different levels if you're thinking about, a market target or a security target? What would it be at different levels or different times? And what this does is it sharpens your thinking. It also allows you to come up with an initial forecast, even on topics that you may not know much about at all. And it avoids falling into a fallacy, kind of 50-50 fallacy, they sometimes call it, where if I ask you, what is the probability that Scotland will vote for independence next year? I don't know anything about Scotland. 50-50. And the idea is that 50-50 is somehow being neutral when we think about an uncertain future. But no, it's 50-50 very rarely is being neutral. And if you think about it, you can say, well, what if that election, or that Scotland going for independence over the next month, would you say 50-50? Or tomorrow, would you say 50-50? Or in 100 years, would you say 50-50? And chances are you wouldn't. And just going through that thought experiment, you'll come up with a mental slope, even for topics you don't know much about at all. And then you go back to the original question. So will Scotland vote for independence next year? Well, 50-50 is pretty high, maybe, given everything. Maybe I might be somewhere south of that. And that's something you can do pretty quickly, and keeps you from sitting on the fence thinking that you're in a safe, neutral zone when you're not.
Excellent. All right. So setting that base rate, getting that base rate, and then doing the scope sensitivity by zooming in and out for different time scales to see, what feels right for you. Share with us the other side of the coin. So for a decision maker who's being shown all these probabilities and predictions from a wide variety of sources, what are the key suggestions you would have for decision makers on how to navigate the predictions that they're being flooded with oftentimes? What's the best way to make the best decisions, assuming you have really capable people doing the analysis, but they're still coming up with different results? How do you navigate that?
Well, so first thing is that all the people coming up with different results, we should expect that. We should expect a crowd to have a diversity of view, and we should expect there to be a range of forecasts. And what we want to do is use some math to get an aggregation, and we want to find the best possible aggregation for that crowd and rely on that using best methods. But for the decision maker, the first step that's more important than anything is getting the question right. What is it you're trying to decide? And what is the question that you can pose to your crowd that will help you make a better decision? And if you pose a question and you go, well, if the answer is 10% or 90%, it really wouldn't make it. That's not a good question to be posing to your crowd, because it's not going to help you think about better decisions. So getting the question right is really important strategically to have it inform the things that really matter. As you do that, though, one of the really good benefits of this kind of an approach is that you can use it to evaluate the kinds of decisions you're thinking of making to see if it will have the desired effect. So you can pose a question to your crowd like this: if we build this plant in this country, will I see revenues go up 20% over the next 10 years or whatever? And you can pose that to your crowd, and if they assign a low probability to your desired outcome occurring after that decision, that can be useful for you, because you're learning from your own crowd that the decision you're thinking of making, they don't think it's going to do what you want. And that can help you go and look for something else instead, while also holding yourself to account too. So for a decision maker, you got to get the question right. There's another angle too that's really important for decision makers, is the distribution, right, of the probabilities. So if you want the best possible forecast, the people making those forecasts should be indifferent to the tails, for instance. So if it's a small probability of it occurring or a small probability of it not occurring, all I should want to do as a forecaster is deliver the best, most accurate probability estimate. So that if I say 90% probability on 10 questions, 9 times it'll occur, 1 time it won't. That gives you confidence I'm a good forecaster. But when it comes time to make a decision, those low probabilities might have a huge impact. So you need to take that into account in a way that the forecasters do not. And then there's a third thing too for decision makers, is even if they're thinking probabilistically, there's a moment of decision, right? We move forward. We need to do this, and we need to get people to do things. And that's a completely different skill set. There's a wonderful example of that from history too, with Dwight Eisenhower on the eve of D-Day. He wrote 2 letters. Letter number 1, he read off to the troops. Victory is ours. We're going to go defeat the Nazi menace. We're on our way. It's the future is ours. But he also wrote another letter that he put in his back pocket, saying that the mission failed and the responsibility is mine alone. He was thinking probabilistically about the potential outcomes, but he was being very decisive in getting people to do things.
Excellent. Before we move on, I do want to dive a little bit deeper. So you said that, getting the question right is critical. Could you give us like any formulaic approach to this? Like, when obviously we're the judges of how valuable will the answer to this question be to our outcomes. But in general, is there a formula to forming these questions, like a checklist of sorts, to make sure that like, yep, this is the question, framed optimally?
Yeah, so there's the strategic part and there's the tactical part. The strategic part, there are different frameworks you can use to identify the right kinds of questions to be posing. And often on more complex decisions, it's not going to be just a single forecast question that you might be posing to your own crowd. It might be a cluster, might be several of them, as a way to connect the scenario that you have in mind with a probabilistic future that you can draw from your crowd. It's rare that you can do that with a single question. You'll probably want 3 or 4, or maybe even more, a cluster of questions to be able to tackle it. And there are good ways to do that. You can borrow from scenario analysis to come up with those topics on the strategic side. And again, at every step of the way, if the answer that I get from this, will it affect the decision that I need to be making? And if the answer to that is no, then you want to rethink things. On the tactical side, getting the question well written is really tough. In the original first year of the research project, the US government wrote their own questions. And they wrote questions like this. And you might remember a few years ago, there was a Hong Kong-based tycoon who wanted to build a new canal through Nicaragua, right? And this was an important strategic question for the US intelligence agencies. Will China be making an increasing presence in that part of the world? So they posed the question, will construction begin on a canal in Nicaragua by date X? Okay, what's the problem? How could that possibly go wrong? Well, the way it could go wrong, and did go wrong, is what does construction begin mean? Does it mean you have to build a canal? Or does it mean you build a road through the jungle where none existed? Does it mean you put a golden shovel in the ground at a ceremony? Does that mean construction began? And that's what happened, by the way. They had an opening ceremony, golden shovels in the ground. That was it. No more happened. So the question went bad because they didn't think through how it could go wrong. This is a really useful concept, not only in getting questions right, it's in the forecast as well, is this idea of a pre-mortem. If events go in an unexpected way, what might those unexpected ways be? And you can ask yourself questions like that to tighten up the question process itself. But then when it comes down to it, there is a checklist, just like for forecasting. There's a checklist that you can have for writing questions. Everyone will come up with their own, but there are a few good things that need to be there. Definitely, it needs to be verifiable. So if it occurs and you look back in time, we can all agree, yes, it occurred or it did not. It should have a clear date. It should have clear resolution criteria, and it should be unambiguous to anyone who reads it that they're forecasting the same question.
All right, excellent. So from a strategic perspective, ask a few questions to cluster them to get like multiple shots on goal to get that wisdom of the crowd. Tactically speaking, asking these questions around like, well, what could go wrong and how do we incorporate that into the questions? And then making sure it's verifiable. Thank you for that, Warren. Just very, very quickly, the other two things you mentioned, distribution of the probabilities. You said that the analyst might ignore the low probability stuff, but for a decision maker, ignoring the low probability stuff could be like life or death sometimes if it's that low probability thing can like sink the whole ship. So share with us any practical suggestion when it comes to that for a decision maker, as well as your Dwight Eisenhower 2 letters example. What do we do with that? Like, should we be always preparing for the other side of the decision? Like, would like to get from you like a specific piece of advice on what we should do when we're reflecting on that scenario.
Yeah, so if you pose a question, and so you've got your unbiased, independent crowd of forecasters giving you the best possible forecasts, and you find that on a number of questions that they're assigning maybe a 10% probability to something, so that's a pretty low, but if it occurred, my goodness, it would be devastating to your business model or to your security outlook or whatever. So that 10% from your perspective of a forecaster is low, but from a decision maker, it can be alarmingly high. So imagine the forecast question is, will there be a nuclear incident resulting in the deaths of at least 100 people? 10%, it's not super high, but from a decision maker's, my goodness, that's horrible. And so that will should prompt you to pose additional follow-on questions to be able to better monitor that low probability event is a great way to approach it. So what are some of the things that might occur before such an event occurred, right? So what are some signposts that we might see leading up to it? And then that will give us a monitoring system to better understand what that risk looks like. It also gives us an opportunity, if we're in a position to do so, to test interventions that might alter with the way that forecast looks in a way that is more in alignment with our own desired outcome.
Okay, excellent, Warren. I've got one more question for you, and then we're going to dive into audience questions. For everybody participating live, if you haven't already, please fill out that quick 1-minute exercise so that Warren can take us through it. And secondly, and most importantly, try to think about both, what are your questions for Warren when it comes to how to make better decisions and how to predict better, but also if there's specific things that you're thinking about, like what's going to be the outcome of X, Y, or Z, think of those two, and together we'll have Warren either share with us his prediction or share how he would go about predicting those things if he hasn't yet predicted those. So we're going to get to that in just one moment. Warren, my last question to you before we dive into the audience Q&A. So I'd love for you to just walk us through a specific example, okay? Let's say we're running an organization, which is true for many people here, an organization or a team, and we are, let's say, concerned about a particular technology or a particular competitor eating our lunch over the coming couple of years. Let's say we sell something and Amazon is starting to sell it too, right? How would you say is, like, in an ideal world, how could a company best go about, a lot of what you just mentioned? So basically just putting into practice, not like every play-by-play, but just generally, what would be the order of prediction, the order of operations for predicting what's going to happen and coming up with a game plan to implement a lot of the frameworks that you shared with us today?
Sure. So you can use the same crowdsourcing techniques to come up with the questions that you can use to forecast them. And that's a really good way to deal with exactly that kind of a situation. So, okay, here's a new competitor that are nipping at our heels. They think that over the course of the next 5 years, they're going to eat our lunch. Okay, so let's go to our crowd. Step one is to get from the crowd, what are the things that, what are the risks that this competitor represents that we should be paying close attention to? And we'll do it anonymously, where everyone will submit their topic, or more than one, along with a rationale for why they think that risk bears monitoring. And it's all anonymous. And then we advance so that everybody can see everybody else's comments. So what we just did is we captured everybody's views. Every voice was heard, not just the loudest ones, not just the most aggressive ones. Everyone's view is being captured. That was a lot of value. Then everyone sees all those proposed risks to be monitoring the rationales, and you'll see them all. So now we're benefiting from everybody else's view, and we can say, okay, well, nominate the top 3 or 5 risks that you think we should really pay attention to. So we're getting a crowd weight on those risks. Then we now have all those risks ranked by our internal crowd to give to the decision maker and say, here are the risks that the crowd thinks you should be watching. The decision maker might also have their own view about risks to be watching and might have inserted those into the mix as well. That's what I do, by the way, when we do this internally. And I'm sometimes quite surprised and disappointed to see that things that I think are quite important, the crowd, our internal crowd, does not. And that's useful for me. So, but now I've got the force rank, and I can make a decision whether to use that, the crowd's views, or insert my, or whatever. And those become the foundation for the forecast questions. Then we put those questions to our internal crowd or to external super forecasters if you want somebody outside doing it. And we'll now get an initial forecast of those risks, right? So, and it might be that the forecast from the crowd is much lower or much higher than what we think. So it's a way for organizations to update their beliefs based on what their internal or external crowd thinks about it. Then what you can do is put it on a dashboard, a monitoring system, so that you can see these risks monitored in near real time. As people get new information, change their views, they can capture it on their own internal dashboard to be monitoring just how risky this competitor is. Now, where it gets really fun is, okay, now if we take this action, to blunt the competition or to create blue water between us and the competition? Will it achieve our goals? And we can pose those questions as well. And the forecasting process itself may even bring to light additional risks or additional solutions to help reduce those risks that then in turn become new forecast questions. So it becomes a system. So the way to monitor the risk from the competitor who's about to eat your lunch, and that's a big risk, it's existential, it's worth getting it right, it's worth paying attention to, it's worth monitoring in an ongoing system. Something like this can sit on top of whatever other processes are in place to boost the signal that you're generating internally. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent overview of essentially, like, my key takeaway here is, like, really clarifying the question, getting everyone to submit anonymously, then identifying the top 3 to 5 risks, then force ranking it, then getting the initial forecast internally, then externally. But the beauty is, like, also then monitoring it, making it a dashboard, and keep asking, well, how do we deal with this? What are each solutions? Like, rinse and repeating the process with each potential solution. Very powerful and something for all of us to reflect on. Warren, would love for you to share with us, that activity. If you received some of those submissions, share with us kind of like how we can reflect on that, and then we'll go into the audience Q&A.
Sure. So it's right here. I'm going to advance it so everyone can see the results locally, but I can tell you that. So the question is, will there be a fiscal stimulus by the end of the year, right? The range is 0 to 100, and the median is 50. So, and I actually like to see a big range. That tells us that there are a lot of different perspectives at work. That's good, because if everybody's kind of clumped together, there might be some groupthink, and so we would need to do some other things to make sure we're not falling victim to groupthink. 0 to 100, that's as wide a range as you can get. Median smack dab in the middle, 50. So this is normally where we start. We start with that, and then we will go through these different steps and make revisions. We'll make updates to that number. And if we have more time, we would go through some of those steps, and I can wager with strong conviction that the range would tend to narrow and that the median will move. And more often than not, it moves in the direction of the outcome by going through those steps. But it is that at 50, I can tell you that there's a similar question that's been posed for the super forecasters, where they have a very different view from this crowd. They have a 5% probability that there will be a fiscal stimulus by the end of the year. But I'm going to take this and I'm going to go and maybe adjust my forecast up a little bit based on the wisdom, because this is an independent, different perspective here. And just one word too on the diversity of views being really important on a team. I'm sure it's here because there are a lot of people with different backgrounds, different occupations in different industries, different thought processes, different cognitive styles that will give us a diversity of view. That's really important when you're putting teams together, to not have clones all from the same schools, using the same models, saying the same things. You really want different perspectives being brought into play. So when you're filling out that mosaic, you've got people who can bring different tiles to fill in, and that accelerates the process for everyone. It's one of the big advantages of having teams of forecasters.
Okay, excellent, Warren. Thank you so much. Diving in now to the audience Q&A. Let's do our best to just spend 1 minute per answer to get through all of these. There's a lot of great ones. First question from Hugo Naley. He asks, will AI outperform humans in accurately predicting and forecasting black swan events?
Oh, I love this. Yeah, I'm glad that came up. So AI and black swans. Well, black swans by definition, you don't see coming, right? So maybe it's more like gray swans that we're thinking about. And how can you identify gray swans? There's, I think, a useful division of labor to be had. What we know is that artificial intelligence can be very powerful where there's a lot of data and it's relatively stable, and it can do wonderful things on a certain set of forecast questions. Where there's a fair amount of uncertainty, where there's subjectivity, where the data isn't that consistent, which turns out to be most of the real world still. You can have both. You use artificial intelligence to do a lot of that heavy lifting to narrow the set of options down, to bring all the different base rate information that's available into the process. And then you have very skilled humans do that final judgment. And that seems to still be the best way to deal with real world situations. There have been numerous studies, including one that was just suspended by the US government, where they pitted humans and machines in different combinations to see how they could come up with better forecasts. It turns out that the humans, by a wide margin on real world questions, continue to outperform the machines.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Warren. A couple of people, Marco Silva and Dan Carlton, both asked, do you have a list of go-to tools you use in your forecasting process, like beyond Excel and so forth? What are some tools that you would recommend?
Well, so everybody has a different approach. This is another really cool thing about being on a team where different people use different kinds of tools. So some super forecasters will be very formal and they'll have Bayesian models, right? So here are all the factors that are going into my forecast. Here are the weights I attach to them. If these certain events occur, then I'm going to adjust my forecast by this much. And I'll have a very formal model that way. I mean, we're all Bayesians in that sense. New information comes in, we change our view, but some will be very formal about it. Others will be very data-driven as well and build their own models in Excel and Access, and others as well. Others are more storytellers, to be honest, and they will think through qualitatively what are the sorts of things that might lead to this event occurring, and what are the sorts of things that might lead to this event not occurring. And by pooling all of those different perspectives, these different ways of thinking about uncertain events together, it becomes pretty powerful. And if Phil writes about some of the specific things that some super forecasters do in his book. So that would be a good place to go if you want to learn more about that.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a couple of questions also around, like, so Hugh Winters asks, how would we predict an unknown, e.g. instead of a competitor taking us on, could a new business model wipe us out? So hold that thought. Another anonymous question is after getting to a baseline, how much should you incorporate black swan type situations in your projection process? So basically the impact of the things that we can't foresee, how do you bake those in?
Well, let me give maybe two quick anecdotes. One is just over a year ago, it was a year ago, September, we were in Canada with a bank doing a workshop, and the team there, one of the important things for their investment thesis for the year ahead was, what will China's economic growth look like? And they had a discussion, they came up with something, and the facilitator there asked them to do a pre-mortem. If it ends up being that that's not the outcome that we get, why might that be? And somebody said, well, there could be something like SARS occur again. Boom. I wish we had really run more with that, but they did catch it as a low risk, high impact event, and they adjusted their view accordingly. We wish we had done more with that, hindsight, but we do now. And so one of the things we do explicitly is when we're thinking about consequential questions or topics, we'll explicitly include a question for the forecasters to nominate a low impact, high probability risk that is, in their view, being overlooked or missing altogether in the dominant outside narratives. We're asking them to identify potential gray swans explicitly, and you can use scenario analysis tools to come up with some of those. And if you're thinking as a forecaster, you'll be getting focused on that low probability zone and really be rigorously thinking about what that might be. And that's something you can do quite quickly using the same kind of survey we were talking about before. You just ask explicitly for a low probability, high impact events that are getting underestimated.
Okay, excellent. Seems like a good life practice in general, whenever, even when you have strong conviction on something, still being disciplined about, like, okay, but if I am wrong, what could be the reasons that I might be wrong about this? Listing them out, seeing them through and just at least going in with your eyes open, but also you might realize that you maybe missed something in your analysis. So thank you for that, Warren. Since the US election is on top of mind for a lot of people, not just in the US, but also across the world, share with us your team's perspectives based on the latest of where we are with the vote count and so forth. What are the key predictions that your team is making that you think would be most useful to all the leaders on this call? So given what the election results look like they're going to be, what are the key changes we should be expecting in the coming weeks, months, and potentially years?
Yeah, so on the US election itself, we have been, there are some things, so we were talking a little earlier too before the session, that when you're coming up with a forecast question, that in itself is a form of forecasting. What is going to be relevant 3, 6, 9 months and beyond from now? And there's some topics that I think we can safely say are going to be quite relevant in the year ahead, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who's running Congress. And this idea of trust busting and breaking down big tech companies is a risk that is higher than it has been, and is something that I think is safe to say worth monitoring in the year ahead. That is very consequential from what goes on in Washington. Beyond that, though, is now that we're getting a sense of what the composition might be, some topics that seemed really relevant a week ago are really ephemeral and they're disappearing. So the notion of packing the Supreme Court, probably not a really good question to be spending a lot of time on. But where are tax rates going to go? Very consequential. And a really big one that we've had a lot of interest from clients to be tracking is what's going to happen with tariffs. Will Biden reverse some or all of the Trump tariffs on China, on Canada, on Europe, and all over the place? And so we're in the process of launching a series of questions to get to the tariff issue, which will affect the economics of a lot of industries here and around the world. The preview is, at least in the view of the super forecasters at the moment, is that Biden's agenda is going to be plenty full, at least through the first half of the year. And so the probability of action on tariffs is looking pretty low, maybe the 5 or 10% at the moment. But we'll revisit that because we're going to get a lot more information. As that new information comes in, we'll be updating those forecasts.
Okay, so just maybe like a couple seconds on each of these. Will big tech companies be forced to potentially break up in the near future based on your forecast?
We don't have that forecast live yet,
okay.
But the way I'd approach it is, what's the base rate? How often do big companies get broken down because of antitrust legislation? It's pretty small.
Okay, what about vaccine and COVID? What are the probabilities that a vaccine will be mass distributed in the near term? Have you looked at that one?
So we've got two questions. One is on our public dashboard, so anyone can see it, is when will there be a vaccine in wide distribution, which we're defining as 25 million doses in the US. And we've had that running since last March. The probabilities have moved around, but they've generally kind of centered on somewhere in the second quarter of next year. And if we were to set a date, probably around the 1st of June. The second one is when will it be in wide distribution, right? So enough to basically say it's no longer something that is going to be dominating the headlines day after day after day. And that's looking like maybe the fourth quarter of next year at the earliest. So it's not going away in the headlines, but a vaccine in the first half of next year has got a pretty high probability.
Okay, excellent. And just in just a quick minute, when it's bigger questions like, are we going to destroy the environment, or are we just going to actually turn things around, or are we going to colonize other planets? Like when you look at much bigger, longer term questions, which still have some impact on our near-term decision-making, what suggestions would you give for those bigger questions?
Well, those are both great examples of where you'd want to take a cluster approach, break it down, turn it into signpost questions that you can kind of bring that distant future more into the more reasonable horizon. I think in the case of the environment, so what's the base rate of us completely obliterating the environment? It's well, though we do tend to figure things out. So just me speaking personally, I'd wager we will figure it out, but we're obviously quite slow at doing it. Colonizing other planets, well, if there's no end date, I have high confidence that we will be doing that. If it's in the next 10 years, nah. In the next 50 years, maybe. So I go to that scope tool to come up with a more informed forecast.
Awesome. Beautifully said. So thank you again for putting into practice the frameworks you've been giving us. Final question for you. How can our community best support you, best engage with you, your team, and your work? And do you have a final piece of wisdom or call to action you'd like to leave us with to conclude this conversation today?
Well, everyone is certainly invited and welcome to come and try their hand and send their teams also to our public forecasting site, Good Judgement Open. We got a lot of questions there, and we have new challenges going up, including on finance and a new one from The Economist getting started in the next few days. And really, we're delighted to have conversations to probe these issues in more depth. What I really value is learning from others who are grappling with similar problems, how they're navigating and getting through them, so can kind of learn what the best practices are out in the real world. So I welcome those conversations, whether it's about training or getting the super forecasters to tackle their topics or building these capabilities internally. I welcome those conversations. And the parting thing is that, Phil Tetlock has a great way of summarizing what all this is super forecasting is a skill that can be cultivated and is worth cultivating. The way to cultivate it is to go out and do it and practice it. And it's good for decision makers to try their hand a bit, but so we can appreciate how it works, but what really matters is building a culture within teams so that they incorporate it into the way they go about their daily work, and it will show measurable improvements as we've seen with other organizations.
Excellent, Warren. I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us these critical tools. I think even if you improved our decision-making by 1% over a lifetime, that could be massively consequential. But I think the improvements, especially if we implement these practices across our teams and become better at this over time, I think the percentage improvement will be a lot greater than 1%. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Wish you a great weekend. And thank you, everybody, for joining us as well. Hope to see you all again soon. Thank you, Warren. Take care.